Today's scripture is found in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 5 through 9. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you."
Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day.
Now, Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties.
Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?"
So this morning, we're privileged to have Roger Kruger with us as our speaker. Yes, he's related. We lovingly call him Uncle Roger. He and my dad are brothers. He currently lives in Milton Freewater, but he began pastoring over 40 years ago when I was about 8 years old, down in Idaho, and was in Oregon a number of years in the Upper Columbia Conference. So we're so grateful that he continues to pastor. You know, pastors may quit earning a living, but you never take the pastor's heart out of them. So we're glad that he's willing to share the messages with us this morning. And I assured him we're not expecting him to quit by noon, but we told him by 1 o'clock he definitely should wrap it up.
What a privilege it is to worship with you good folk. I always enjoy going around and speaking in various churches since I've retired in 2010. It's been such a joy to be a guest speaker at many of the churches, and I've always felt that I need to explain something right up front, why I don't wear a tie. And I do have a biblical reason for that. And sandals. Yeah, I'm in good company, I think, doing that. But in Ezekiel 44, verses 17 and 18, it says that the priest, when he comes into the house of the Lord to minister, he shall be clothed with linen garments, and no wool shall come upon him. And he shall not gird himself with anything that causes sweat. So I think I've got good reason there. Anyway, this morning I would like to share with you 2 verses of scripture that have puzzled me all my years of ministry. In fact, I was retired before I found out what it really meant. And one of them has to do with Solomon, as the kids read, but I noticed that their version didn't really use the expression that the King James uses. And this is what the King James says: "Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I'm a little child, and I do not know how to go out or come in." So, here it was, when God approached Solomon in this dream, Solomon said, "There's something I don't know." Now, you remember, he asked for wisdom. Now, almost everybody, even if they're not Christians, know that Solomon asked for wisdom because they've heard that story about the baby, you know. But do you know why he asked for that? Because his dad, David, knew how to go out and come in, and he didn't know how to do that. And I thought it was interesting to see that a number of versions render going out and coming in. They're kind of trying to guess what in the world that means. For instance, the New International Version says, "But I'm only a little child and don't know how to carry out my duties." Living Bible says, "I'm one who doesn't know his way around." The New English Bible says, I am a mere child, unskilled in leadership. The New Century Version, which is a version of the Bible that was translated for kids in the 6th grade and less, the New Century says, I'm like a little child. I don't have the wisdom I need to do what I have to do. The Message Bible, and I thought this was very creative. I enjoyed reading that one about 10 years ago. I'm too young for this, a mere child. I don't know the ropes, hardly know the ins and outs of this job. I thought that's pretty good in talking about going out and coming in. And then the Clear Word Bible says, I'm so young, I lack the wisdom to do it. Now, what in the world did that mean to go out and come in? Sounds like he might have had a problem with doors. Huh? I don't think that was probably it. But when we come across a text in the Bible that we don't understand, what's the first rule of interpretation we should follow? Well, that's very important. That's a given. Let the Bible interpret itself, right? So let's ask the Bible, what did you mean when you say to go out or come in? Now, this expression goes back to the time of Moses, when Moses was old and was concerned about the next leader. If you want to go back to Numbers, the 27th chapter, for those of you who bring your Bible, I hope you brought your only weapon that you have against the devil. And I know sometimes you have the little cell phone and all of those little techniques. I still like to have a book in my hands, to tell you the truth. In fact, when I retired, the first thing I noticed when I retired was, hey, I can sit down and read the Reader's Digest all the way through, or the Review and Herald, or Signs of the Times. You know, I had the time to just enjoy reading some of the magazines that I'd been getting for years. And I had, well, I hate to tell you this, but when I moved from Columbia City, pastoring in the Oregon Conference, to Upper Columbia, the truck driver told me he'd never hauled such a heavy load before. And it was because of my 4,000 books. And I had magazines of religious liberty, Signs, These Times, clear back to the 1960s. And I was going to read them when I retired. Isn't that dumb? I can't even keep up with the magazines that I get now, and I can read all of them. But anyway, this is what it says in Numbers 27. Then Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation who may go out before them and go in before them, who may lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep which have no shepherd. So, what Solomon was saying is, I don't know how to go out or come in. And Moses says, God, please send someone after me who knows how to lead the people out and lead them back in, whatever that means. Joshua is that chosen leader, you remember. And Moses wanted to make sure, I'm going to push this back a little bit. I feel like it's pushing me away. He was the one who was going to be able to lead the people out and bring them back in. And then when Moses makes his retirement speech, this is what he says in Deuteronomy 31, verses 1 and 2. And I'll just share the first part of that. I'm 120 years old this day, he says. I can no more go out and come in. Now, this wasn't the retirement age for pastors, by the way. He gave that back in Numbers 4 and Numbers 8. And I want to just share with you what it says in Numbers 8, verse 26. God spoke to Moses. These are the instructions regarding the Levites. At the age of 50, they must retire from their work. They can assist their brothers in the tasks in the tent of meeting, but they're not permitted to do the actual work themselves. These are the ground rules for the work of the Levites. When I discovered that, I wrote a letter to Elder Falkenberg, who was our conference president at the time, and told him that it says the priest should retire at 50. And I think I was about 55, 58 at that time. Yeah, that was pretty young, Tyler. But I discovered even then at that age that I wasn't able to deal with the issues of the church like I could when I was younger. It was a lot more stressful for me as I was nearing that age. So Moses is just saying, I'm not able to lead the people out and lead you back again. That's the reason I'm retiring. And then you remember the speech that Moses gave on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, where he did the blessings and the cursings. In Deuteronomy 28:6, blessed shall you be, that is, when you obey the Lord. Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. And then in verse 19, the opposite, if you disobey my commands and my statutes and my laws, cursed shall you be when you go out and when you come in. So what in the world does that mean? Does it mean when you leave your house and when you come back in? I doubt it. But even Jesus used this expression himself. You know, in the Gospel of John, where he has those great 8 I am statements, I am the bread of life, I am the living bread, I am the vine, you're the branches, I'm the resurrection and the life. Just before he said, he says, I am the door in John 10, verse 9. I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. I never really noticed that before. What is this go in and out all about? So that still leaves us with the question, what are we supposed to do when we don't understand a text? Let the Bible explain itself. And here's the key text that explains this whole thing. Now, I read a whole bunch of concordances, commentaries, and none of them really spoke to the issue. I haven't yet sent a letter to Andrews University and suggested that they give the real meaning of this going out and coming in, because these other translations just really missed the boat. And here's the key text. Joshua 14, verse 11. And here we find Caleb talking to Joshua. You remember, as they're dividing up the land, nobody wanted the hill country, and Caleb says, I'll take the hill country. And notice what he said. As yet, I am as strong this day as I was in the day that Moses sent me. He was 40 then, and now he's 85, okay? As my strength was then, even so is my strength now for war to go out and come in. This is a military expression. It's used in the context of war. So now here's what Solomon was really saying. Lord, I don't know how to go out to war. I don't know how to lead the people out to war and bring them back in. And what Moses was saying was, please, God, find somebody who can lead the people out to war and bring them back in. Everything in the Old Testament represents something spiritual for us today, right? 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11 says, all these things happened unto them for what? Examples, ensamples. So let me ask you this important question today. Are we still in a war? Do we have an enemy? Who is he? That's for sure. And his minions. So today we need to know how to go out and come in. Every day when we go out, we know we're going to be fighting battles, right? We've got a war that we need to win because someone is out to get us. So I'd like to have you turn now to 1 Samuel 18. And here's a passage that talks about David, Solomon's father. And just we'll notice the context of this expression, going out and coming in. 1 Samuel 18, verses 12 and 13, let's notice first. And Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and was departed from Saul. Now back in verse 10, it mentions that the Spirit had left Saul. Therefore, Saul removed him from him, that is David. He removed him from his presence and made him his captain over 1,000. You remember why he did that? He wanted him to be killed, right? Because he was a jealous king. So he made him his captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. Wow. Verse 14, 15, David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. And did he know how to go out and come in before them, right? You remember what the women of the city shouted when he would come in victorious over the Philistines? Saul has killed his and David his. Boy, reasons to be jealous, right? I've always been touched when I've been reading through 1st and 2nd Samuel. The number of times the Bible record says, and David sought the Lord, or and David inquired of the Lord. I'd like to just share a few with you. In 1 Samuel 23:21, or verse 2, I'm going to just read these quickly. Therefore, David inquired of the Lord, should I go up and fight the Philistines? And then verse 4, then David inquired of the Lord again. Another passage, 1 Samuel 30, verses 7 and 8. David inquired of the Lord again, should I go up and follow the Amalekites who have captured our families in Ziklag? And God says, go up and regain your families. 2 Samuel 2, verse 1. And it came to pass after this that David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? And I was to be made king. And God said, yes, go up to Hebron. Another, Psalm 34, verse 4. I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and delivered me from all my, you'd think enemies, my fears. He delivered me from all my fears. And then this one caps it all off. Psalm 119, verse 10. With my whole heart have I sought thee. So David knew that before he went out to war with his troops, he worshiped. He sought the Lord. You know, it's interesting. In 2020, I read through the Andrews University study Bible. And every year I try to read through a different version of the Bible, and I think I'm about 45 or 46 of them now. And I liked the Andrews Study Bible because, well, first of all, it used equivalent weights and measures and values and distances and explained a lot of those things in the notes at the bottom of the page. So I made sure to read all the notes as I was going through. And I came across this when I was reading in Psalms. At the bottom of the page, it says Psalms 20 and 21 are companion royal psalms, probably to be sung at the time when the king went out to do battle, Psalms 20, and when he returned, Psalm 21. Both were probably sung antiphonally and with alternating responsive parts. I thought, wow, that's interesting. We might even know. So if you have time this afternoon, read those two psalms, what they sang before they went out to war. And I've got to share this interesting fact with you too, that I learned from the notes in Andrew's Study Bible. You remember the story of Samson, how he had been visiting the city of Gaza. Now it's been in the news a lot lately, right? We've been hearing a lot about the Gaza Strip and the city of Gaza. Well, he was visiting a woman of the night there one night, and the Philistine city leaders heard that he was in town, and so they were going to trap him. So they locked the gates. At midnight, though, it says that Samson got up and he left, and the gates were locked. So he tore them up with the two posts, and he carried them to the top of the hill. Now, I had always assumed that was the top of the hill overlooking Gaza. But in the notes, it pointed out, well, right in the text, if you read it in Judges 16, verse 3, that he carried it to the hill overlooking Hebron, 38 miles away. Doesn't that change the picture of Samson's strength and also of his trickery? You know, he loved to do tricks in more ways than one. So we find David worshiping before he went out to battle. How did they come back from the battles? They came back to worship. If they lost, they came in to worship to see why in the world did we lose God. And if they won, they came back to celebrate with great joy and thanksgiving that God had helped them win the battle. And if they were in the midst of a battle, they came back in to be restored and to be renewed and to be refreshed so that they could go out and continue the battle. In other words, they would come to the temple and worship before the Lord. Now think about church on Sabbath morning. We come to church, and if we've lost a struggle or a temptation, we repent, we confess. If we won a victory or a struggle or over a struggle or temptation, we come in and rejoice and we celebrate and we thank God for giving me that victory. And if we're still in the middle of a battle, a struggle or a temptation, we come in again to be refreshed and strengthened so we can renew and continue that battle to overcome. And I just want you to remember this. We might lose a battle, but we can still win the war. So are you following me? What I'm talking about this morning is the importance of worship. Worship. I'd like to suggest 3 salient points about worship this morning. Number 1, worship brings God's presence into our lives. 1 Samuel 18 again, I'm just going to refer to it quickly. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him. The Lord is with David because of his worship. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore, when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. David knew how to behave wisely even before he became king. Even as a shepherd boy, he knew how to worship. In fact, we have a whole book of songs, many. And I think he wrote over about 100 of them out of the 150. They're Psalms of David, of encouragement, of inspiration, of intercession and gratitude, and even Psalms of disagreement, disappointment, and depression for the children of Israel's worship as well as for ours today. In fact, you remember when David wanted to build a house for the Lord says, no, that's going to be up to your successor, his son. But David got all the preparations ready. He gathered all the materials that was needed for the new temple. He planned every detail from the dividing of the priests into 24 courses to what hours the temple was to be open. 24 hours a day. Did you know that? This, I thought, was an interesting observation. In 1 Chronicles 9, verse 33, these are the singers, and in this chapter it talks about the role of the priests and the Levites. These are the singers, the heads of the fathers' houses of the Levites, who lodged in the chambers in the temple. And they were free from other duties because they were employed in that work day and night. Wouldn't it be nice if we could keep our churches open 24 hours a day? So that if a member felt like they needed to be in a visible presence of God in his house, they could come. But because of the immorality of culture that we have around us, We can't leave our sanctuaries open like that anymore. David wrote and sang many songs to the Lord. He was a worshiper. What made him a great king was he was a great worshiper. And what made him a great warrior was he was a great worshiper. He knew how to go out and come in with worship. So, worship brings God's presence into our lives. Number two, worship brings God's fear into our lives. I want you to see this word in a little different context this morning. Back to 1 Samuel 18 again, it says Saul was afraid of David, and that when Saul saw he behaved wisely, he was afraid of him. God left Saul, and an evil spirit came upon Saul. It was this evil spirit in Saul that made him afraid of David. We're in a war. Again, I remind you. And just think about the wonderful privilege we have as sons and daughters of God to be walking around during the day knowing that Jesus is by our side. And the devil comes walking up to us to give us a temptation or to give us problems. And Jesus steps up to our side and the devil says, oops. And he slinks away stealthily. What a privilege it is to know that we have the presence of God as his children. Do any of you remember Merlin Kretschmar? I heard some of you do. When he came back from the mission field, he was a pastor in central Washington someplace, and I'm not really sure where. I was thinking it was around Yakima, could have been here. But I was at the time in college, and I was the MV leader for the village church. And he came and had a mission program one Sabbath afternoon. And it was pleading for offerings for a $10 church. Do any of you remember that $10 church program back then? And I was so moved by his appeal. I was sitting up in the balcony after I had introduced him by my girlfriend. And I was so touched by his appeal. I had a $10 bill in my wallet, and I gave that whole $10 bill. Now, college kids, don't have that much money. And after I gave that, I wish that I hadn't. Isn't that terrible? So how much credit did heaven give me for that one, huh? But anyway, after they left the Upper Columbia Conference, they went back to New York City in a van ministry. Didn't you remember that? And I was on their newsletter. I got their newsletter every month. And one of them told about an experience of one of the girls who had been helping in the van. She didn't get away till about 11 o'clock one night. And as she was walking back to her apartment, she noticed in the darkness there was a shadowy figure that was following her. And so she crossed the street, and the shadowy figure crossed the street as well. And then she thought, I'm in danger. And she says, God, please send your angels to protect me. She got home safely. But about 1 o'clock in the morning, she heard sirens outside the window, and she noticed a bunch of police cars down there, and a woman had been assaulted. They had caught the man, and he was in prison. The next day, I don't remember if it was Elder Kretschmar or one of the other staff members from the van who went in to see this guy. And they talked with him, got acquainted with him a bit, and he says, now, why didn't you attack that other girl? And he says, are you kidding, with those two big guys beside her? Wow. God can do that for us. That's what I mean by he brings fear into our lives. So number one, worship brings God's presence into our lives. Second, worship brings God's fear into our lives. Third, worship brings God's wisdom into our lives. Again, in 1 Samuel 18, it said a number of times, David behaved himself wisely in all his ways. Now, Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived, right? That's what the Bible tells us, and it even compares him to some other names at the time, 3 brothers, and said he was even wiser than those 3 guys. I'd like to know more about them, but we really don't. Why was he the wisest man, and how so? Well, it was because he asked God for wisdom. He asked God to teach him what his father David knew. Now, Rich, I was going to have you come up and tell me a little about the stuff you learned from our father. Just before our dad died, he had a conversation with Dad. Come on up and share that about. He told Dad, my dad's name was Solomon, and of course, he knew a lot about all kinds of different things. But Rich challenged him one day, and he said he was smarter than Dad.
Growing up, knowing that your dad's name is Solomon, there's a lot you have to live up to. And I can remember many times that we would be discussing various things. I probably remember most of all, my dad loved nature, and we lived at the time up at Kamiah, Idaho, and we'd gone down to Orfino periodically for things. And I can remember one time there was a flower growing along the side of the road that didn't look like what I thought was Indian paintbrush. And I would tell my dad, Dad, we need to stop there, son. We don't need to stop. I know that it's Indian paintbrush. I said, Dad, just to settle this, sometime we need to do that. So one time we did it. And my dad sheepishly had to admit that he was wrong and I was right, that it wasn't paintbrush. It was scarlet Gilia. Those of you that are into flowers, look that up. But anyway, through the years, I go through college, and I can remember our grandpa, my dad's dad, moved in with us in College Place when I was in college. And one day, the 3 of us were discussing various aspects of wisdom and knowledge and things like that. And of course, having my dad's name Solomon and being a wise man, I had a lot to live up to. So anyway, I finally said, Dad, I said, I'm smarter than you. And he looks at me and he says, and how is that? I said, well, number one, I've learned everything Grandpa has taught me, everything that you has taught me, plus everything I've learned on my own. I have to be smarter than you. Well, I can't say that really settled it, but anyway, it was rather interesting.
Thanks, brother. I thought that was a pretty neat story to tell in context of Solomon and his father David. Solomon was not only the wisest man of his generation, he was also the wealthiest. You remember the Queen of Sheba came to visit him? And in 2 Chronicles 9, I just want to read very quickly now, verses 1 to 4. Now, when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with hard questions, having a very great retinue, camels that bore spices, gold in abundance, precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for Solomon that he couldn't explain it to her. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon, the house he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers and their apparel, she noticed all of these things were done so neatly and in order. But then I want you to notice this last part of this paragraph. And she noticed his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord. And there was no more spirit in her. So here, she saw this wise king, this wealthiest king, the most powerful king in the world at that time, going into his house to worship, the house of God, to worship his God. And he knelt down on his knees and prostrated himself in submission to his God. And it says there was no more spirit in her. Do you remember what the word spirit means in Scripture in the Old Testament? What was it? Breath. it took her breath away. When she saw this powerful king kneel down in the presence of the Lord. Now, I got to tell you about her gift. In verse 9, I've got to read this one first, though. Verse 5 and 6 of 1 Chronicles 9, 2 Chronicles 9. She said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land of your acts and your wisdom. Howbeit, I believed it not their words till I came, and mine eyes have seen it. And behold, the half of the greatness of your wisdom was not told me, for you have exceeded the fame that I heard." Then in verse 9 it says that the gold that she gave him was a gift of 120 talents. Now a talent was 75 pounds. So 120 talents would be 9,000 pounds of gold. That's 4.5 tons. But look what he took in as tribute every year. If you drop down to verse 13, it says that the tribute that he gathered from the nations around him was 666 talents of gold. So there's that odd number again, 666. And that was 49,500 pounds, nearly 25 tons of gold that he received every year in tribute from the surrounding nations. What would you do with that kind of gold, that amount of gold? Anyway, the Queen of Sheba at this time was reported to be the wealthiest and the wisest woman alive. So she came to test him with these hard questions. She came from where the Magi came, from the east, and there they worshipped wisdom and wealth. Now she hears about this man who all are saying he's the wealthiest and the wisest, so she comes to prove him with hard questions. And in the East, they love riddles, so they love Proverbs. Probably not the book of Proverbs. I don't know if they've probably heard about it yet. But in 1 Kings 4, verse 32, it says, Solomon spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Now, the book of Proverbs has 275 of these proverbs that he wrote. Psalms has 2 of his songs, Psalm 27 and 172. And then, of course, there's the Song of Solomon, or it's also called the Song of Songs. What does Song of Songs mean? Well, what does King of Kings mean? The greatest of all kings. The Song of Solomon was the greatest, considered the greatest of all songs back then. But Solomon answered all of her hard questions, and she saw his wealth and all of his wisdom. But what got her was when she saw him go into the presence of his God, and it took her breath away. Isn't that what we want? We want that for the world, that when they come to us with all their hard questions, that God gives us wisdom to answer them. But what we really want them to see is the presence of God in our lives. That's what she saw in Solomon. Now, let me share with you that other puzzling text that I wonder, what in the world does that mean? And it's in Ezekiel chapter 46. It was about the new temple that they were to build after coming back from Babylonian captivity, which never happened, by the way, because of their unfaithfulness. They did finally build a small temple, but it wasn't like the one planned that Ezekiel mentions. Ezekiel 46, verse 9. This is just 2 chapters after the priest should not wear anything that makes them sweat. Well, when the people of the land shall come before the Lord in the solemn feast, he that enters in by the way of the north gate to worship shall go out by the way of the south gate. And he that enters in by the way of the south gate, he shall go out by way of the north gate. He shall not return by the gate whereby he came in. I thought, that's kind of crazy, isn't it? That's kind of weird. Why in the world? Now, both of these questions were answered to me by a Sunday preacher, believe it or not, who was preaching out of the Old Testament. I'm so glad that some of these Sunday preachers are preaching out of the Old Testament now. But I give him all the credit for it. And he's the one who really showed me the progression of text that I've shared with you this morning. And I've added a whole bunch of other things to kind of make it more interesting. But let me explain. It's not crazy. What God is saying here is that every time you come into my house to worship me, and you really worship, you will go out differently than when you came in. Right? Doesn't that make sense? In other words, if you came in sad, you can leave glad. If you came in discouraged, you can leave encouraged. If you came in wounded, you can leave healed. If you came in tired, you can leave refreshed and strengthened. And if you came in feeling guilty, you can leave forgiven. However you came in, if you came to really worship, come into my presence, when you go out, you will go out differently. But here's the key. When we go out, we do not leave from his presence. We go out with his presence, and that makes all the difference. So I'd like to just close a few thoughts talking about what Jesus said about going out, coming in. In John 10, verse 9, I'm the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. In other words, not only can we find salvation in Jesus, but he will be with us in our warfare, our daily battles. We don't have to go out and fight our battles alone every day. Jesus is there to help us. And what do you see in your mind when you hear of find pasture? I see finding nourishment, finding rest, finding peace and tranquility. Yes, even in the midst of our toil and our turmoil. Another psalm I want to share with you that uses going out and coming in. And you remember this one, Psalm 121, verse 8, the Lord shall preserve thy what? Thy going out and thy coming in from this time forth and forevermore. I hope you have a better understanding of just what that means now. May God bless you as you go out and come in, is my prayer for you this morning. Maybe it does have something to do with doors.